Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today is truly a day on which humankind has made considerable progress. Earlier today, in Cape Canaveral, Florida, SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket was launched flawlessly. It will carry the Dragon capsule to the International Space Station, where the capsule will dock with the station this Friday, May 25th, deposit some supplies there, and then return back to Earth with some materials and experiments from the space station. Unlike other capsules currently in use, the Dragon will not be destroyed upon re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. Rather, it will be preserved, and it could be reused. What's remarkable about this is that this is the first time that this sort of flight will be made to the International Space Station with a private vehicle. SpaceX is a private company. It is currently participating in a joint venture with NASA. Both SpaceX and NASA have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into this project. But it is a very positive step forward for NASA in utilizing the entrepreneurial energy of private firms, in utilizing market forces to help advance humankind's colonization of space, to help advance scientific research, and to bring considerable cost efficiencies to that endeavor. Up until now, yes, NASA has utilized private contractors and private vehicles for some minor tasks, for instance, launching a satellite into orbit. But for this kind of massive project, for working with an International Space Station, this is a first. And hopefully more extensive utilization of private spacecraft will occur. It's interesting because as the privatization of space unfolds, we have the opportunity to enter into a real space renaissance. There was an initial burst of space exploration in the 1960s, largely motivated by the Cold War and the desire of the governments of the United States and the Soviet Union to outdo one another, to show to their citizens that their respective governments are the best and can beat the other government in a scientific race as well as in an arms race. Initially, because the space organizations of both the US and the Soviet Union drew in the best scientists at the time, there was a lot of innovation, there was a lot of flexibility. This is why the USSR had some early successes in the late 1950s and 1960s, and why the United States was able to very quickly catch up and land the first man on the moon in 1969. But as is often the case with large national bureaucracies, it stopped there, it stagnated there. And while there were some worthy projects after that time, the system became ossified, it became reactionary, it became resistant to progress. And the involvement of the private sector was very much needed to jumpstart that accelerating space exploration once again. So I'm very hopeful for the coming several decades. I wanted in this presentation to address the comments of a man that I very much respect. I have linked to his video in the references section accompanying this presentation. He is Neil DeGrasse Tyson, an astrophysicist, director of the Hayden Planetarium at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I very much enjoy listening to him. He's an excellent presenter, and he also has some excellent things to say about the advancement of science and the need for skepticism about traditional religious beliefs. He himself is an agnostic. Much of what he says on the subject of religious belief and non-belief very much resonates with me. But this is an area in which Mr. Tyson and I don't quite see eye to eye. There's some merit in what he says, but I have to strongly disagree in other respects. So in this particular video, he says that there's a lot of, quote, delusional thinking about the private role in space exploration. He says that private enterprise in the history of civilization has never led large, expensive, dangerous projects with unknown risks, and he reiterates that that has never happened. Well, I can provide some counterexamples right now as to how it did happen in the past. Who invented the automobile? Was it governments? No, in fact, it was a series of private tinkerers, some dating back as far as the 18th century. And of course, it was a private entrepreneur who made the automobile accessible to the masses through the methods of mass production that he perfected. That was Henry Ford in the early 20th century. Who accomplished electrification and the widespread availability of electricity to the masses? Was it governments? No. It was entrepreneurs and inventors such as Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. And sure, in the aftermath of their breakthroughs, governments attempted to use legislation to spread these innovations to the masses in certain countries, for instance, through the construction of national highway systems or through the construction of national electricity grids in certain parts of the world. But it's still the case that it was private entrepreneurship and initiative that led to these technologies coming about in the first place. And only then, once these technologies existed, could politicians, in an attempt to attain popularity from their constituents, try to spread these technologies. I, as a libertarian, don't believe that government has that role legitimately. But if you just look at history, it's not the case that government investment necessarily precedes private investment. It's often quite the opposite, that governments go in and take the credit and attempt to, quote, democratize private inventions. We can look at the most dramatic development in history, the Industrial Revolution, and clearly see that it was not originated by governments at all. In fact, the way it started in England in the 18th century was that certain religious minorities were barred by law from holding titles of nobility, owning large amounts of land, and working in certain prestigious professions such as medicine and law. These were intelligent people. They wanted to make a living, so what was left for them to do was to tinker. And as a result, many of them developed new machines, faster ways of producing existing goods. They built factories, they hired workers, and in a sneaky way, without the consent, and initially without even the notice of the British ruling class, they initiated the Industrial Revolution. What about computing? Even the first computers were not developed by governments as such. They were developed by corporations, large companies such as IBM. There was a lot of university research done. One could say some of that research was government funded, I will grant that. The internet was originally a military project in the 1960s, and through the 1980s it was fairly closely controlled by the US government. There was some attempts to integrate the internet with research facilities, universities, but it did not really make a large public impact until the 1980s, when the floodgates were opened to the private sector. And the federal government stopped actively managing the internet, but rather let essentially anyone who wanted to utilize its capacities. What about a huge development in history, the evolution of technologies for recording and playing music? Governments have pretty much not been involved at all in that, unless you consider the very light role that individual patrons who happened to hold government office played prior to the Industrial Revolution. But really, all of the technology for recording music, from the record player to the CD player to the MP3 player to the various computer instruments that we have, all of that is privately invented. Tyson stated that, in his view, the reason why all those things that I just described couldn't happen was you cannot have a capital valuation of these kinds of activities. They're too dangerous, they're too risky, and the risks are unknown. However, you can have entrepreneurs who are willing to take those risks in exchange for a sufficiently large reward. Some people have a much higher risk tolerance than others. And remember, these are not your typical financial analysts or managers. They're not middle management in a large corporation. Many of these individuals have very unique personalities and unique visions of how they want the world to be. They're also willing to take an immense amount of risk, they think it's a calculated risk, in order to capture an immense amount of gain. Remember that the first entrepreneur to figure out how a particular new field works is going to make a tremendous amount of money and is going to open up a tremendous amount of value to consumers. These people have a vision and they have a will to make it happen. Think about Elon Musk, the head of SpaceX, a very, very apt example of this kind of individual. He was one of the founders of PayPal. He made his fortune on that. Now, he actively runs both SpaceX and Tesla Motors. Tesla Motors is also based on a vision. He wants to bring very durable and ultimately very affordable electric cars to the market. With SpaceX, he has a vision of sending humans to Mars. He has stated he wants to retire on Mars. Clearly, he's not thinking like your typical corporate middle manager. He's not thinking in terms of maximizing short-term returns on investment. He would be fine with not receiving his biggest return in 10 or 20 years, or longer, because his model of making a profit is based on a vision that, if it succeeds, will earn him huge amounts of profit, but it's also not for every businessman. It's for a certain kind of individual. The pioneer, the explorer, the person who is willing to take these kinds of risks. Tyson says the first Europeans to the New World were funded by governments. And I will grant that. Columbus, Magellan were funded by governments. However, look at what happened when the New World was first discovered. It was first discovered in 1492. During much of the 16th century, there wasn't all that much in terms of development in the Americas. There was some in the Spanish colonies in Mexico and South America, but mostly that was just focused on the extraction of gold and the immediate application of that newfound wealth, where it didn't create inflation, to purchase resources. The real economic development of the American continent occurred in the 17th century, when finally you had private individuals, private joint stock companies moving in, founding settlements, engaging in trade with the natives, extracting resources, building up commercially viable settlements. The 17th century, not the 16th century, was when the New World really began to flourish. Tyson says it would be nice for private enterprise to take on low Earth orbit activities, and he acknowledges that tourism could easily drive that. And I'm glad that he says that. I agree with his comments there, and I'm glad that he at least perceives a role for private space exploration. He doesn't discount it altogether, and in that he is many, many steps ahead of the typical talking head on the news, who will say things like, well, isn't this a loss of our national prestige to have private companies instead of the government directly building these vehicles? I think Tyson at least sees the current state of affairs as something that he can accept and something he can enjoy. He said, essentially, that he would be the first to line up for tickets for a space tourist venture. So he's definitely a man who's open to technological progress and open to creative and new ways of doing things, for which I salute him. But I think there's more to be said for the role of private enterprise. It's also needed to make the breakthroughs, the big, big kinds of advances that will really capture the human imagination and change our lives, such as the colonization of Mars would change our lives. Governments are notoriously conservative when it comes to funding scientific endeavors. Politicians tend to want a fairly safe return on their investment, something they can boast about to their constituents without angering too many of their constituents. Especially in the United States, this is a problem because there's a large and very vocal anti-science bloc. Various religious fundamentalist groups have fought certain scientific research. I, as a libertarian, am very skeptical of government funding of scientific research. But my skepticism arises out of my political philosophy, not out of any dislike of science. If you have publicly funded science, unfortunately what happens is the people who are opposed to science per se now have a legitimate argument to make, and that is they're taxpayers, they didn't consent to this, so why should they have to pay for it if they don't agree with the aims of that research? And that sort of argument, with sufficient lobbying and sufficient political pressure, can be used to undermine that scientific endeavor. On the other hand, in the private sector, where people spend their own money, they can take their own risks with that money. And every individual is different. Individual temperaments vary greatly. Not everyone has the risk tolerance needed to invest in a groundbreaking new venture that may or may not succeed. Not every private space company is going to succeed. Some may fail quite dramatically after millions of dollars in investment. However, it's much easier for an entrepreneur to justify that kind of expenditure than for a politician. If a politician puts money into a long-shot project that costs hundreds of millions of dollars and it fails, all of a sudden there will be allegations left and right of misconduct, carelessness. Maybe somebody will launch an investigation, or somebody will start a recall petition for the politician. No such problems for an entrepreneur, particularly an entrepreneur who has a controlling interest in a company that he founded, such as Elon Musk. Elon Musk can afford to take many more calculated risks than a political structure could. And furthermore, entrepreneurs can be motivated by more than money alone. Of course, the goal of every company, as long as it's a for-profit company, is to earn a profit. But there are many ways to earn a profit. For an entrepreneur that is in the space business, surely there has to be another motivation, a desire to see progress in space exploration, perhaps a desire to be the first in bringing that progress about. Otherwise, those people wouldn't be in the space business. They would be in a much safer business, a much more established business. Elon Musk isn't in this just for the money, even though his strategy may ultimately be much more profit maximizing than someone who looks for a 2%, 3% annual return on investment. It's just a farther seeing and farther reaching strategy. So I think Tyson underestimates the power of private enterprise. I think if human beings can get to Mars within the next few decades, it will not be governments and politicians that get them there. It will be private enterprise. NASA may have some incremental role in jointly funding certain projects. The best thing about the current arrangement, even though I as a libertarian am very skeptical of public-private partnerships, is that first, it moves away from 100% governmental control of the project. Second, it embraces the idea of private involvement in space exploration. It doesn't attempt to foreclose on it. Commentators like Charles Krauthammer would want the government to control everything. they wouldn't want private enterprise involved because for them it's an issue of national greatness. For me, it's an issue of human greatness. It's an issue of expanding the reach of humanity. It's an issue of expanding the reach of the individual. And it's an issue of protecting humankind from existential risks. The fact is, unless we colonize other planets, we are sitting ducks here on Earth. We are vulnerable to the next asteroid that comes along, to the next great cataclysm of any kind. A supervolcano could wipe out much of humanity. Unless we have some other recourse, unless we colonize other worlds, we are still in an age of barbarism. People like Elon Musk and some of his competitors, people like Richard Branson and Peter Diamandis, are trying to get us out of that age of barbarism and toward the stars. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and may SpaceX and other private space companies have a very bright and glorious future.